first of all, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Garrett Lang. I'm a software developer turned software inventor that's now an entrepreneur, and my hobby is writing and discussing practical philosophy. I'm also the executive director of the Freethinker Institute, which is the organization that brought this event to you tonight. We advertise on a lot of different meetup groups, so you may have come through a different meetup group, but it's all sort of organized by the FTI. And that's our abbreviation, Freethinker Institute, FTI. And so we're a not-for-profit looking to support and empower members. And by the way, I have 3 monitors, so I'm going to be looking up in different directions. Sorry to not give you guys eye contact, but I'm very monitor-friendly in my my setup here. So we're a not-for-profit looking to support and empower members. We really want to help members be the best version of themselves, seek truth, and be fair through transformational personal and professional development. Papi está en reunión, princesa. No, papi está en reunión. Busca mami. Sorry. So my daughters are taking a shower. So or a bath. We have free events every Tuesday evening covering a wide range of topics not typically covered in academia or industry. And we have weekly members only events for applying practical wisdom into our daily lives. We have only one rule in the FTI, which I'm going to ask all of you to maintain tonight, as we do every night and in our online community, and that is to be polite. People are at their most receptive to other people's ideas when those ideas are presented politely. So it benefits all of us to stay polite because other people will listen to us more carefully by staying polite. And that is a strictly enforced rule that you'd be warned if you don't follow that rule. And I also recommend basically doing what's called listen to understand. And that is, if someone says something that you think is absolutely outrageous, rather than getting angry and trying to tell them why they're wrong, just ask them why they believe what they believe. And I try to do that myself as well, and keep me honest if I don't do it. That helps us better understand the perspective of someone who sees things very differently than us, which some of the comments in the social were talking about how we need to all better understand each other and how social media is helping us get to know more people. And I really like that optimistic view of social media. I think that's the benevolent side of social media that it's capable of. Whereas right now, I think a lot of social media is causing more harm than it's helping, than it's doing good. I think it's capable of doing more good, but like all things, social media is power, and power can be used for good or for evil. And we have to be the ones to embrace it for its good sides rather than giving into the dark side, to use the Star Wars allusion reference. So that said, can you guys see my screen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and go through the agenda. So first, I'm going to give a historical context for war, and then I'm going to define what I mean by unjust wars, since tonight is a tangible plan to end unjust wars. I'm going to tell you there's a little bit of a bonus that not just can this solution end unjust wars, it can reduce human rights violations drastically. And so it's a 2-for-1. And then I'm going to explain the plan in simply one slide. It's actually a very simple plan. There's nothing super complicated about it other than that I think it thinks about all the incentives, and I think it's well thought through, but it is actually very simple. And then I'll explain why I think it's tangible, how I think it would have prevented recent unjust wars, how I think it can prevent future unjust wars. And then I'm going to take a vote on who's convinced, although we'll probably do that at the end of the night, actually, because I want to have the conversation so that people can raise their objections to the plan if they have them. I'm sure people will. We always get an animated group at these events. And so I want to have that conversation and try to patch up any holes that people shoot into the plan to see if we can make it a better plan through our conversation tonight. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yep.
All right, cool. So first, let me address the historical trend. We live in the healthiest, wealthiest, least violent world that human history has ever known, which is actually a really good thing, and if you read Steven Pinker's book on enlightenment now, he gives a huge amount of facts and data and historical analysis to support that, which I'm not going to do tonight. I'll just say read Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, or if you don't have enough time to read the book, read the Blinkist summary like I did. It's much shorter and much faster, and it gives you the key points. Although I'm sure the book is well worth reading for those that have the time, but as an entrepreneur working over 100 hours a week, I don't have time to read the books. So I read the summaries. That said, I think war is on the run, so let's finish it off once and for all. And I'm going to propose we do it tonight. Not that we'll be able to enact this plan tonight, but maybe it'll get into the hands of someone who can enact it, which is really what my hope is in presenting it tonight and putting it up. Hopefully we'll get this one up on YouTube before too long. We have a big backlog. If anyone knows any volunteer video editors that want to help a not-for-profit, we would love a volunteer video editor to get our backlog of events onto YouTube. So let's define unjust wars. So a just war is, I'm actually going to describe a just war first, which is a war where the country being attacked has human rights violations, where the government of that country has been warned about those human rights violations by the UN, where the government of that country has failed to make significant efforts to fight against those human rights violations within a reasonable period of time of having been warned, and where the invading country or countries replace the prior non-compliant government with one that will address human rights violations for its population. So basically removing a government that allows human rights violations to occur and replaces it with a government that will not allow human rights violations to occur. Does anyone, well, I'm told I should leave questions for the end because we have a big group. So I'm going to leave questions for the end, but take notes if you have questions about any of the slides, and we can go back to the slides as needed after the presentation portion. So the second step is the plan, which is a loose alliance. And here's what I propose for the loose alliance. First of all, any country can join. Joining is easy, no red tape, none of the votes and the all that stuff required by NATO, none of that. You just, if you want to join the alliance, you can join the alliance. If it's found that a country does not address human rights violations identified by the UN in a reasonable period of time, with a reasonable effort, then they will be ejected from the alliance. So no human rights violators are allowed in the alliance. And anyone violating it without taking significant steps to try to stop those violations will be ejected from the alliance. Attacking any other member of the alliance results in immediate removal from the alliance. Once removed from the alliance, you can't rejoin the alliance for a reasonable period of time. And I'm not going into the exact numbers of years because I don't want to debate whether it should be 1 year or 2 years or 1.35 years, not important. If we can agree that there's a reasonable period of time that makes all the rest of this hang tight, that's what matters to me. I'm not here to define the numbers of years. Other people can do that another day if they like the plan. Now, here's the kicker is if any member of the alliance is invaded, all other members of the alliance must make a best effort attempt to defend that member of the alliance or be rejected from the alliance themselves, leaving themselves vulnerable to being able to be invaded. So that's the alliance that I'm talking about. Now, how could this play out into action? Well, if the NATO countries join, which why would they not? They're more or less, attempting to keep human rights violations to a minimum already and trying to police the world as best they can. So why would NATO not want to join this alliance as a starting point? And that would give the alliance enough firepower to defend countries that are members. As soon as NATO joins, or even a significant portion of NATO joins, every country without human rights violations is going to join immediately after that, because none of them want to be the next Iraq. Let's face it, Iraq got invaded, even though the UN said there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the US decided to go into Iraq and, at great expense of both life and money, the US went into Iraq without true international support. We did buy a lot of friends, and all of our bought friends agreed with us to let us go in. But let's be honest, there wasn't really wholehearted support for going into Iraq at the time that it happened. Even though both left-wing and right-wing media were supporting the war at the time. Let's not digress too much into that, but let's just say that countries know that, they know that if the US or another wealthy country wants to invade a country badly enough, that country without being in this alliance would risk being invaded. Whereas if you're a member of the alliance, you now have the backing of all the other members of the alliance supporting you. No one's going to go into a country when you have that level of backing to defend every member of the alliance. Like no one in the alliance is that significant threat at that point. So how would this have prevented unjust wars that were recent? Imagine that, in Iraq, as an example, imagine that this alliance had been created before Iraq. And imagine that Iraq was a member of the alliance and the UN had said Iraq is in full compliance. And if the US, when they invaded Iraq, found the rest of NATO was defending Iraq, the US would not have gone into Iraq under those circumstances. No way in hell. So that would have actually prevented the Iraq war as we know it and saved millions of lives and trillions of dollars of US taxpayer dollars, as well as Iraqi lives, as well as a lot of American lives and lives of military service members, brave military service members from around the world. So second, imagine that Russia knew Ukraine was a member of that alliance. Why would Russia go in if they knew that the entire free world was going to converge on Ukraine and absolutely defend it, come hell or high water? Putin might be a cheeky guy, right? Like he thought he was going to take over Ukraine with no resistance, just like he did Crimea. So he probably figured no one's going to put up a fight. I can take it if I want it. And so he did. But he found there was actually much stauncher resistance than he expected. And let's not go into all the reasons why, but let's say that if Putin knew that the entire free world was going to converge on Ukraine and defend it against Russia, he would never have gone in. And let's go further back to Nepal. China invaded Nepal in the 50s. If this alliance had existed in the 50s, and I think it was the 50s, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, feel free to Google it. I didn't, I'm just doing that from memory, and my memory is very fallible. If China knew that the whole free world would have converged on Tibet, Tibet, not Nepal. What am I saying? So on Tibet, I need to fix that. So on Tibet, I did the slides very last minute. So I had this whole thing written up beforehand, but the slides were last minute. So if China had known that the entire free world would have defended Tibet, China would never have gone into Tibet, right? Because it would have been too high a cost to pay, and they know that they would have been repelled. But who's going to defend, a small Buddhist country that, there was no other reason for people to go in and defend Tibet. So Tibet is now part of China and being taken over by Han Chinese, who are, replacing the native Tibetans. The Tibetan spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, is in exile. The child that was supposed to choose the next Dalai Lama was captured by the Chinese government and no longer knows who he is. He was captured as a child. And so, things went very poorly for Tibet and their spiritual practice. That said, let's look into the future and what this simple plan will do. First of all, it creates a huge disincentive to cause human rights violations. Any country that causes human rights violations knows that it leaves the country vulnerable to invasion and leaves the leaders personally vulnerable for international trial if not being killed at war, right? And that leaves the leaders of the country knowing that they themselves could be vulnerable, as well as the country's resources could be completely tapped. They have no hope of winning that war, right? If you're fighting against the rest of the free world, even the US can't win a war against the entire rest of the free world. Even if China didn't participate, if India and the rest of NATO participated, or even just the rest of NATO in general, the US isn't going to win a war like that. And the US would never wage a war like that against people that they already see as allies. And the second thing is there's a huge disincentive for invading a country unjustly, because doing so will create such a huge resistance that you have no chance of winning. All you're going to do is spend lots of money and lots of lives and make your own country hate you. So leaders would think twice before making any kind of invasion to any country that's a part of the alliance. Because as soon as they invade a country that's a part of the alliance, they themselves are ejected from the alliance, and now they're guilty of human rights violations because they invaded a country unjust. They invaded a country that was not that was a member of the alliance. And so basically, you create a huge disincentive for countries invading unjustly. So that's really as simple as it is, that's the end of my presentation. With that, I want to open up to questions. Raise your hands. Let's ask. Feel free to shoot holes in it. Very open to feedback and questions and criticism. Usually it's best to start with clarifying questions before you critique, but I know this group and a lot of people like to critique first. So do as you will, although I encourage clarifying questions before you critique, but you can do what you prefer. Howard, you have your hand up first.
Thanks. Have you read Margaret Macmillan's book, The War That Ended Peace?
No.
Like basically that's a really good read.
What's it called?
Between about The War That Ended Peace. It's all about the start of World War I. Basically, they had a whole sense of mutual defense pacts, and it did in fact drag everybody into a big war. Probably the big failure as 1914 approached is very few people visualized the level of disaster. A second kind of unrelated point, as I would like to introduce the term fun, glorious war. The Americans had one in Grenada quite a few years ago. I think Iraq was probably perceived that way. Obviously, most of us don't want to do that, but some of us do. It's great for getting elected. You get to be powerful. You get to dress up in a military uniform. As I recall, in 2003, anytime I saw George Bush on TV, anytime George Bush had to do an announcement of any kind, he headed for a military base and a whole bunch of guys and soldiers in camouflage standing behind him as he gave his speech. He really exploded the idea of being a war president.
You say that again, the last sentence?
He really.
We lost you, Howard. Are you still there?
He said he really exploited the idea of being something about the president or a wartime president, or
Okay.
which, yeah, makes sense.
Could work out to a point. The logistics of defending Tibet in the 1950s would have been mind-boggling.
Don't disagree with you, but if most of the free world had made a concerted effort to do it, I think it would have been very doable. While it might have been very difficult to do logistically in the 50s, and we can't go back in time, I haven't figured out time travel yet. Give me another decade. So while we can't go back in time and fix that, I would argue that China was also far weaker than they are now militarily and economically in the 50s. So it would have been much easier to hold them off than it would be right now. The war with Taiwan would be a much bigger deal.
They would be. Remember, the Korean War was fought against China. I believe I heard the line that in the U.S. military, somebody in the U.S. military made the comment that if you like the war in Iraq, you'll love the war in Iran.
If you like the war in Iraq, you'll love the war in Iran.
Yes.
I don't get it.
Think about it.
You mean when we removed the Shah?
No, this is back in the early 2000s while the war in Iraq was getting out of hand.
Okay. I see what you're saying. Okay.
Can you say more about that, Howard?
That's I don't understand the war in Iraq. I don't understand what made somebody think they could overthrow Saddam, set up a democracy, and have it become pro-Israel. Somebody was not connected to reality.
They
Right.
didn't. They didn't. Yeah. Like
Now,
actually,
Iran has a far more popular government. There's a lot more Iranians. They're probably a lot more unified. If you go in there and bomb the crap out of them, you'll make the Islamic, the Shiite priests look good. You're
Howard, I don't think they really did think that they would install a democracy in Iraq that would support Israel. Like I've done a lot of like looking into the war in Iraq and what the motives would be. And unfortunately, the person with the biggest motive to go into Iraq was Cheney, because he had huge Halliburton stock that went up in huge amounts of value. And there was really no other good motive. There was no good motive to go into Iraq other than that I've been able to discern. because we agreed that we wouldn't make money off of oil contracts. I guess we have made a little bit of money, but very little off of the oil contracts. So that wasn't really a good motivator to go in. So that said, tonight's not about Iraq specifically, and I don't want to digress on that, but it is and also the other thing I wanted to mention about Iraq is that Colin Powell, who I have a huge amount of respect for, told Bush that we had no exit strategy in Iraq and that we shouldn't go in. That was part of the Powell doctrine, is that you should never go into a country without an exit strategy. And he got ignored. And unfortunately, this is why we have the mess that we do in Iraq today, with ISIS having taken power and filled the power vacuum that Colin Powell knew was going to get created. And he even called that a worse enemy would be created in Iraq than the ones that we had there before. So that said, I want to let Gene go.
Yeah, hi, Garrett. I think this approach is a little too simplistic for a few reasons. First of all, like alliance, there's, other than joining NATO, it's one of the issues is voting in. But the other issue is, one of the issues is other countries allowing other countries to join. So that's a major issue.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that? Like,
well, it's hard to join NATO because all the other countries have to let you join. So
yeah, that's what I said. There's no entrance qualification.
Yeah, but that's just one issue. The second issue is how much money you're actually investing in your military, because a lot of countries would like to use it. They would like to join, not spend anything on their military, not invested, not train them, just for, because they would assume they would get protection from the alliance. So that would put strain on other countries to, cover their back. Another thing is, you're thinking most countries are rational actors. While Western countries, for the most part, there are quite a few rogue states like Iran, North Korea, even China might get to that point. So that would cause problems.
Gene, we forgot to say this in the beginning, but if you can limit to one point at a time, we try to keep so that we can keep the conversation going. We try to limit to 1 point at a time. And
Sure,
let me address the one about.
Was a little racy. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, it's great. I love that you have a lot of points to make, and definitely, like, when you put your hand down, just raise it again, and then we'll get you back in line to speak up again. I just want to give everybody a chance to talk, and I also want to be able to address your comments without spending 10 minutes addressing them all at one time.
Yeah, it's my first time here, so I'm just learning.
That's okay. Yeah, no. I forgot to say that in the beginning. Normally I say that up front is, when people are commenting, to ask one question or make one comment at a time, and then just raise your hand if you have another one, and that way we'll get you right back in line again. So as far as like people not investing money in their military, I actually see that as a benefit of this process, because the only thing that would prevent the process from working is if literally everybody in the alliance stopped spending so much money that only people outside of the alliance were spending more money on the military. So actually what it would do is it would give everybody a big reason to decrease their military budget, which would actually equate to more global economic prosperity. Because the truth is, while people say that investing in the military is good for the economy, the truth is it's generally not, because it's not money that's going to give a return on investment. Investing in research does create economic benefits, and investing in economics and in job training and all those types of things creates economic benefits. But actually, I would argue being able to allow members of the alliance to spend less on the military is actually a huge benefit that I didn't point out. So I appreciate you pointing that out, because
that would work for small scale conflicts. Maybe it would deter smaller countries from starting. But what if it's some country like China that has huge military spending, and the alliance would have to go against something like that? And all the countries would decrease their spending, so they wouldn't even be capable of defending another country.
So are you saying that
or just might not want to do it?
So are you saying that you think if an alliance like this was created, the entire free world would spend less money on the military than China single-handedly?
Well, if you break it up into pieces, a whole is usually, in this sense, less than parts of, all the constituent parts of it. because each country would have to worry about their own defense locally. They would still not be 100% reliant on the alliance, even though that might be a good idea. I doubt that would ever happen, at least in the current political climate. So
I agree with you. And I think they would all maintain a certain level of military budget, or almost everybody would maintain a certain level of military budget. And united, if you had, 8/10 or 9/10 of the world against China, including India, by the way, who also has over 1 billion people.
well, India has interest.
And
But
India is
what happened
gonna
if
be
India
quick
and
to-
Pakistan disagreed about this?
Yeah, so
They
I'm
were
not
both
as
in the
worried about that one.
alliance.
I actually think the decrease in military spending would be a good thing. If we could start, reducing the arms race that's going on right now, that would be a huge benefit. And it's a benefit that I didn't point out. So I'm glad that you brought that up. I see that as a positive thing. Nakati, do you want to go next?
Yes. So when there is an unjust war, you assume that everyone will start fighting against that invader, right? So
But I'm not
am I
assuming that.
understanding
What I'm
is
saying is that if they don't, they get rejected from the alliance themselves. And so if they
okay?
don't, they actually put themselves at risk for being invaded because they're no longer a member of the alliance, and they give up the protection that the alliance offers to members of the alliance by choosing not to defend the member of the alliance that was attacked.
Okay, so what is the they are taking care, I think, low probability risk, right? I mean, because okay, I am not attacking to I am that with that alliance, and I am not fighting with you. You reject me, and now I am taking a risk to be invaded, and the probability is so low that maybe I will not see the consequence for the next 500 years.
I mean, if you want to take that risk, if you're the leader of a country, Nakati, go for it. I wouldn't take that risk.
That's not,
Okay, I mean, because I mean, in 100 years, everything will change.
I mean, Iraq
So
got invaded.
politicians-
Who would have thought that Iraq would be invaded when the US went into Iraq? Who would have thought that would have happened? And if you look at the amounts of other types of regime change that have gone on, huge amounts of countries are vulnerable. And I would argue that if you were one of those countries out there that doesn't have a huge military and a huge amount of defense and isn't a part of NATO, you would be clamoring for this kind of alliance, like clamoring for it.
Yes, that
I-
is a good point. So now you are saying, now if I don't have a huge military, I should be in that alliance. So
And the people
which
who-
means
The people
I
who
should.
the people who do
Go
have a big military should also be, because they stand for they stand for an end to unjust wars. So NATO should jump on board right away, and everybody who doesn't have a big military should definitely be in the alliance, as long as they don't have human rights violations. If they do, they're going to get ejected immediately anyway. So no point in joining.
like,
Will
Yeah,
it not bring a political corruption? Because now, in exchange of that, being that, I mean, now I will do, as a small country, I will do whatever the big country wants. Because I am in that alliance, I have small military, and now I will obey the economical, rules, whatever they want.
No, there's no economic concessions.
No,
tied to this.
no, but I mean, you are right. I understand. There is no written rule, but there are also unwritten rules.
Well, those unwritten
know-
rules exist today, Nakati. They exist today.
Yes, that's
Right.
what I'm trying to say.
This isn't changing any of that.
yeah, I need,
Okay. So I also have another topic, but maybe in the next
Raise your
round.
hand again and let's let Diane go.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Diane.
yeah, I admire your idealism. It feels, it's so idealistic. I mean, so you kick Korea out, but maybe somebody sees, okay, Russia gets kicked out too, and they join an alliance. I mean, it's just like I keep going back to, good and evil or power. People want power, they want money. Unless everybody in the world went to therapy or meditated or something, you're going to get this kind of a situation. People want power, they want money. This show on next week, I think it's great. It's just, it's like, what happened to our mayor? You know, and Giuliani was my hero. I met him in a store and I said, thank you, thank you. And he became a horrible, horrible person because of power and money and greed. These are big, big issues for people. I mean, for certain people, you know, and Hitler, you know, the charismatic, insane people take over so often because they have that charisma. And if you look at Trump, he was following Hitler's playbook every step of the way. So, but he just wasn't that smart. My fear is we get someone, you know, following the playbook who is intelligent. So it's, you know, there's too many people out there who are greedy, who are worrying about themselves and their country, or they're getting elected in their own country. And you don't have enough evolved people. You're asking for an evolved consciousness that just is not there.
Why do you think that I'm asking for an evolved consciousness? Like nothing that I pointed out there required an evolved consciousness for anyone. All it did is say that everybody should do what's in their own best interest. And all I did is I laid out a strategy that allowed for everybody doing what's in their own best interest to create the common good. That's one of my strengths, is creating win-win synergies. And so what I did is I laid out a strategy by which the leaders of the free world, which is essentially NATO, could create a snowball effect that creates an effect where everybody doing what's in their own best interest in order to stay in power and keep their money and keep their power, in order to keep their money and keep their power, they have to do the right thing. And if they don't do the right thing, then immediately they get punished.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. Everybody has to do the right thing. Have you ever been in, just take a group, just take a group of 12 people and try to get, you have so much work to get that group to coalesce into a group. And
Yep.
imagine the leaders of all these countries. We are not saints. We have done a lot of dirty stuff.
I agree. But none of what I required, none of what I required or laid out in the plan required anything, elevated from anyone, to be honest. All it requires is follow the plan. But that said, Diane, I hear your point, and I agree with you that there are too greedy people that are power hungry. And, that's part of why I started the Freethinker Institute, is to try to teach people a better road, a more wise road to go down, rather than just seeking money and power. Because money after $100,000 a year isn't going to make people happier. And, power, most people seek power for the wrong reasons. I have a saying that power should be used to empower rather than to overpower. And I would argue most people that are seeking power are absolutely the wrong ones to be in positions of power. And I have an essay on that if you want. It's probably in the online community.
It doesn't matter. I mean, I love what you're talking about, but look at our country. The top 10 trillionaires everywhere, and people homeless on the street.
Yep.
There is the middle class is going, they get richer and richer. You're saying, who needs more than that? For some reason, they probably feel inadequate, whatever. The trillion dollars these people have.
Yeah.
And who gets taxed? My daughter, who doesn't make much at all.
Who pays higher taxes, I guarantee, than those people with billions of dollars.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. Where's the good? You think these people want good? I mean,
again, I don't think that anything in my plan required, billionaires to do anything. It only required the government to take action in their own best interest, and the governments of NATO countries to take action in the interest of humanity, which they generally do already anyway. So, it's not really expecting anyone to do anything differently. It's just organizing them in a different way. That said, I want to let Howard go because he's had his hand up for a while. Howard, go ahead.
Hi there. I was going to bring it up. The problem with an alliance is that you have to keep everybody in the alliance benevolent. The earliest screw up I'm aware of anyway is I believe it was the Delian alliance in ancient Greece to stop the Persians, which was run by the Athenians. And the Athenians very quickly pissed everybody off. And Greece fell apart and wound up in the Peloponnesian War. How do you keep the leading powers benevolent?
So that's the beauty of what I laid out, is that if someone is not benevolent, they get removed from the alliance, right? Not benevolent means violating human rights, creating human rights violations or allowing them to happen in your borders. I would argue as long as someone's not allowing human rights violations in their borders, government allowed human rights violations, then for me, that's good enough that I wouldn't like, sure, I'd love things to be better than that. And I fight for a better world than that. But I think that's a good starting point. If we could end wars, other than against countries that have human rights violations, I think that would be a big movement forward versus where we are today. Does that make sense?
Not really. In the case of the ancient Athenians, the ancient Athenians weren't violating human rights any worse than the other Greeks were. What was happening is they were
didn't have
demanding
this alliance, though, Howard. They had a very different political system, and Athens was more a hegemony rather than an alliance. They were more,
well, that was the problem.
Yeah, exactly. And this is more an alliance of peers rather than a hegemony. It's not the sun never sets on the American empire. It's a different paradigm than that. But your point well taken, that the Athenians didn't do the best job of it. They weren't terrible. They had a lot of value, and but they, that's yeah.
The Persians paid for the Spartans to screw it all up.
Lisa.
Nader.
Yes, I love your ideas, Garrett. One question I have is, who defines what human rights are? And because that's one of the prerequisites for joining this alliance.
Yeah.
And every country has their own interests. They have their own lobbies. Like in the US, there are a lot of powerful lobby groups that get US to do things around the world. So it's how can this alliance guarantee that it's going to be on the side of good and just? Because that's are there going to be some like a document that says these are the human rights and you can't cheat? Because countries will they'll find ways to say, yes, what we're doing is just, but a lot of other countries will disagree with it. So how can you make sure that the countries in this alliance are on the side of good and on the side of human rights? How do you define that?
So that's why I made the UN the arbitrator of human rights. And if you look at human rights violations, the UN is the one that definitively defines, they have a list of human rights that they consider inalienable. That if you want to Google UN human rights, list of universal human rights, they have a really good list of human rights. That is what I'm referring to when I say human rights violations. So the UN already has defined these human rights. The problem with the UN is they currently have no teeth. What this alliance would do is it would give the UN teeth to enforce the human rights violations, not really enforce the human rights violations, but it's sort of a negative alliance, right? Where it's not like an alliance where you invade everybody that has a human rights violation. It's an alliance where you defend everybody that gets attacked, and you defend anyone that maintains their human rights. But then let's say a country like the US, because we're the ones that I know that have invaded the largest country the most recently, decide to invade a country. If it's a country that has human rights violations, as long as we put in place a government that doesn't support human rights violations, at least then some good was done in the world for that invasion, and there's a net movement forward. Now, that said, I don't like war at all, but if there's going to be a war, I would much rather it be a war against someone who has been shown to consistently violate human rights than a war against someone who has not been shown to consistently violate human rights.
Yeah, I agree with you that, we could come up with a list of things that are, it's say, okay, UN created this list and these are human rights. The issue really is, how can we be sure that the US or any of the members of this alliance are going to stick to that 100% in an honest way and transparent way, that, if everybody in the world says, hey, that is you're violating the human rights, But the US, because it's bully, it has a lot of weight, it has all the weapons, then it's going to find ways to get around it. I see that as a big problem in this fight.
I think you overestimate the US's influence. Like we really have a lot of egg on our face because of Iraq. Our international standing is, declining. Other countries are starting to use reserve currencies other than the US dollar. We have we are not all powerful, and a lot of US citizens think we're all powerful, and a lot of the US government thinks we're all powerful, but some of them are smart enough to realize we're not. And we have limited political capital, and we need to start gaining it rather than losing it. And an alliance like this would help us gain political capital and resave face, where we create a defense system against our own wrongdoing, right? Because this would have prevented the Iraq war. It would have stopped the US from going into Iraq if it had existed before then. So I would just say that, I think it would actually have a lot of positive effects about the things you're talking about rather than negative ones. And that said, we have a bunch of hands up, so I want to go to the next person and I'll try to be shorter in the conversations, although they're really good conversations and good points that people are bringing up. So I just like to try to address them. Olga, go ahead.
Okay, hi. Sorry that I don't turn on my video. I have I have problems with my connection, and I could just I really hoped that you say something that could get me more optimistic about situation, what is going on right now, and I'm extremely upset with what's going on in Europe, because I have friends and relatives on all sides of this conflict, and and your plan is really great and could probably work. Although it could really, as already someone noted, could stuck in the first steps how we realize it, and with just defining human rights. For some time, I worked on contract with UNICEF. It's not UN, but it's a children's section of UN. And I was really amazed when I found out that United States did not ratify Declaration of Rights of Child even. And almost all countries ratified it. And if you look at ratification of human rights treaties, that United States did not ratify almost anything. It's like it's on the it's like with China, and even no, of course, European countries and even Russia ratified more human rights treaties than United States. Even Azerbaijan, which has a lot of violations. And I could explain why it did not ratify. With human rights, it's more complex, but declarations of children's rights of the child. It's in the United States, a lot of religious families. And there, for example, right now, it seems like 200,000 children brides in these religious families. And in some states, they did not have even age for legal age for marriage. You could marry anybody, whatever age it is. So it's so many questions, even on this stage of human rights, that's probably that alliance would discuss this, and how you can work with countries that did not want to ratify human rights treaties that most countries agree with. So I'm not sure, although its plan could work, but how you define even basic things, basic human rights, and that's probably it. It's right now I am on looked at a website, and it's just that United States ratified only less than half of international human rights treaties, and like China also. But most countries like Canada, even Russia, again, I said, and even countries of Latin America, they ratified much more. That's it. Thanks.
Garrett, you're muted. Garrett, you're muted and speaking.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't matter whether or not the US had ratified the Declaration of Human Rights or not, because as I laid it out, all that matters is that the UN gets to decide whether or not there are human rights violations and whether or not they're remediated. That's entirely in the UN's hands. Doesn't matter whether or not the US has ratified it or not. So Olga, I get your point, and I know of one reason why the US may not have ratified, not to digress, the rights of children is because a lot of US firms still use slave child labor in countries. A lot of major chocolate brands do that, actually. They haven't rid their supply chains of like slave child labor. Or of child labor, not slave labor, child labor. That might be one reason that's a contentious issue, because they probably have a big lobby. That said, I want to let Jean go again.
Okay, I have 2 points. One is small, which is you said there wouldn't be any economic requirements to join the alliance.
Yep.
But there would still be an economic pressure from one country like the United States. We're just not going to do business with you unless you vote our way. So they would pressure the UN or whoever was in charge of deciding who's violating which rights. But that's a first issue. Second issue, what about ideological conflicts like Palestinian and Israeli conflict? When both sides say they're fighting for human rights and both are probably violating them on both sides, who's going to decide who is actually right in that situation? And if there was a conflict like that, there would be ideological backing from Israel, would be backed by the United States and the West, and Palestine would be backed by most Arab countries. So who would decide a conflict like that?
So the UN would decide. And as far as the economic pressure, all those pressures exist today already, Gene. So nothing that I'm saying.
Well, yeah, and they're not helping. So how would you resolve that?
But Gene, nothing that you're saying would invalidate any of my proposed plan, nor does my proposed plan even.
Well, that aligns. Your plan is for completely ethical behavior from all actors, and I just don't see that happening.
No, it's not. It's not a saying completely ethical behavior of anyone. All it's doing is very simply saying, if you are a member of the alliance, you cannot have UN declared human rights violations that are unaddressed by the government.
Bigger countries will pressure the UN or whoever's in charge to make decisions that will benefit them more than other countries in the alliance. I mean, so how would that?
If you think
that
even
in the United States we have that problem.
If you think that every UN official can be bought and influenced by
not every, a lot of them,
then all right, then I guess you're too much of a pessimist for me to convince. I wish you well. Jeff, go next. So Howard.
Hey, Garrett.
Oh, sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
So thank you for doing this. It's definitely, I think it's a noble adventure. I have maybe 2 questions, maybe 3. So, and I'll tell you all of them up front.
Just do one at a time, if that's okay, just because we have a bunch of,
okay.
Hands up. So if you don't mind, just do one.
No worries.
All right.
Okay. Well, okay. The fundamental question for me because I know you spent a lot of time doing this and you've considered it from a number of different vantage points. So what do you consider to be, let's say that this was going to be organized and launched and really implemented within, let's give it a decade, let's say. What do you think the most difficult challenges would be in trying to make it work?
I tried to shoot up, like, I already went through that process and shot down all of the things that I thought would be the biggest challenges. So I'm trying to think, I think actually the one that Jean just mentioned is the biggest one that remains, which is that the UN could become so politicized that it no longer becomes a fair arbiter of justice. But if you get to that level, that's so pessimistic that it kind of says there is never going to be a solution to any possible, justice in the world in general. It's going to be might makes right, period. And I'm just not that pessimistic. I do think that people who are paid government bureaucrats whose sole job and solely seek to be in a position of power in order to do good in the world are generally there to do good in the world. And I think that they can be good administrators of fairness. And I think that that was actually put to the trial with the Iraq war, where the UN got a huge amount of pressure by the US to say, no, there's weapons of mass destruction there. And the UN didn't back down. They said, no, there's no weapons of mass destruction. We found no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. We've gone in there multiple times. They've let us look at everything that we wanted to look at, and we found no evidence of weapons of mass destruction. And the UN stood their ground. So I think they've already passed the first trial, which is the Iraq war, where they, and I do think that's the biggest barrier. But from my perspective, the UN passed the first test of being a good arbiter of justice, even when under huge amounts of pressure from the US and their allies, our allies.
So you think the Security Council is okay the way it's currently structured?
The Security Council, you mean the UN Security Council?
Right.
No, I'm talking about the weapons inspectors, not the Security Council.
Well, I thought you were talking about the UN.
Yeah, I'm talking about the UN weapons inspectors, not the Security Council.
But you're talking, aren't you considering the UN to be the kind of the judge and jury here?
No, there are different parts of the UN that do different things. The Security Council has a specific set of powers. The weapons inspectors were not, specifically,
Yeah, no, I don't mean just with that example. I mean in general with the way the system as you envision it. You consider to be the UN to be the arbiter here, the judge and
the most fair objective arbiter of justice internationally that exists by far.
Okay.
And I think they've been tried, like I said, in the Iraq war, they've been pressured very heavily to give in to the powers that be, and they stood that test, and they stood strong and stood against the US.
Okay, I'll stop there. I disagree with you about the Security Council, but that's a longer conversation.
I didn't make any comments about the Security Council, Jeff.
Well, then I don't really understand your bringing the UN into it, because it seems like that you're sort of setting up the UN as the arbiter here.
The Security Council is not the only part of the UN. There are a lot of aspects of the UN. It's only one part of the UN.
Okay, so I don't want to,
That's okay. Let's go to the next person. If you want to try to make the case that the Security Council has authoritative rule over all aspects of the UN, you can try to make that case when you raise your hand next time.
I would.
Go ahead. Because if you will, then go ahead and tell me why they didn't get the weapons inspectors to say that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Why did the Security Council not do that when they're apparently supposedly completely influenced by the US?
I think it takes more than one example to have this conversation, but we're good.
Go ahead and give another example. Howard, go ahead next.
No, you don't have to. Listen, really, I'm good. You can move on to the next person.
Yeah, I'm going to move to the next person, but go ahead, raise your hand, and then come up with another example other than Iraq, and give an example where the UN actually came down on the wrong side of justice.
Okay, the problem with the UN Security Council is that the 5 great powers all have a veto power.
Right.
And that includes the United States and Russia. So if justice is against the interests of one of the 5 main powers, it gets voted out.
Right.
Now, one of the comments, another good guy to read is Gwyn Dyer. I'll try to link to his website. The comment he makes in a number of his articles is that the UN's job is not to make the world a better place. Its job is to keep us from blowing ourselves to kingdom come. It's a lower level task, and it's vitally important. And it succeeded at that. We've had nuclear arms since 1945, and they haven't been dropped since, and from September 45 on, they haven't been dropped on anybody. Although we're working on it at the moment.
So just to be clear, again, I'm not proposing that the UN Security Council be the arbiter here. I'm proposing that the branch of the UN responsible, that there be a branch of the UN responsible for evaluating human rights violations be the arbiter, not the UN Security Council, because I agree with both of you. The UN Security Council is deeply flawed, and the fact that everybody gets veto power and the US and Russia are on it means that it's more or less meaningless. You're not going to get anything done of value in the UN Security Council. So I'm not saying that that's where this would go to, not at all.
Well, the United
the
States,
contrary, I would say if it does go there, it would be a failure because the UN Security Council is not going to be a fair arbiter of justice.
Okay, my understanding is the United States consistently refuses to recognize the authority of the World Court in The Hague. The problem here is you have a great power and the UN does something against their interests, they refuse to go along. And this is why the Security Council is constructed the way it is. In many ways, it sucks. But the whole idea is to make sure conversations don't escalate to nuclear war.
Again, I'm not trying to, and I agree with you about the purpose of the UN Security Council, and that's probably why it's structured that way. But again, I don't want to talk tonight about the UN Security Council because that's completely irrelevant to tonight's subject, topic. It has nothing to do with the subject tonight at all whatsoever. It's a totally unrelated subject. So
yeah,
Mike, go ahead next.
Yeah.
Mike Soren, you're on mute.
Okay, I'm only going to bring out one thing.
Go ahead, Mike.
To meet your criteria of one thing. But I need to tell you that what we've heard, there's 32 people here. No, well, we lost one just as I started speaking. 31 people here. And there are 31 factorial opinions. There's several people here with obvious Ukrainian last names and accents. And I would say that even though there's 30, there's one thing to say is we all live in Plato's cave, and what you see depends on your point of view. And there are 31 factorial points of view that are presented here, depending on what you're talking about. I will list a few of them without explanation. The first one is the human rights is what you see depends on your point of view, and female circumcision when Pakistan or Saudi Arabia is head of the Human Rights Commission in their 3-year cycle of being head of the Human Rights Commission, that's good. So if you don't believe in that, you're a profiling racist. So that's one issue. There's a whole, the 31 factorial includes a lot of things like that. We used to be in a bipolar world, mutual assured discussion between two semi-rational organizations like Russia and the United States. and everybody else tend to stay a part of the to stay out of the way of the dancing elephants. And we had a long period, Pinker's long period of peace. We then went into a unipolar world, and we had another long period of peace. And in each case, we abdicate our position of either regional hegemony or global hegemony. And now we're in a double bipolar world. Russia and the United States is one axis, and United States and China is another axis.
Try to finish up, Mike.
Finish up. Because we have abdicated our position in Afghanistan, which was stable, as long as we kept our hands on the stability controls, it worked. When we abdicated our position, we encouraged our friends in the Ukraine, and we encouraged our friends in China to attack Taiwan, which probably is a mid-February problem for us to go through. And that's a human rights condition, and I think China is in charge of. I think Saudi Arabia leaves. No, Switzerland leaves the human.
Hi, Mike. Sorry, we need. Maybe we can continue on that again. Maybe you can raise your hand again for that.
Okay, I'm just gonna finish at one point. So we're oversimplifying, which Gene said. Don't oversimplify.
Yeah, so Mike, there are a lot of people here with a lot of different opinions. That doesn't mean we can't come to a consensus, and I'll be asking everybody at the end whether or not they feel like the alliance I proposed would do more good than harm. Like, in other words,
opinions.
Well, I mean, technically, like we can all have a million opinions. So, but you know, let's not get into the math and statistics of exactly how many opinions. But there are 31 people and 31 perspectives. And so, sure. But what I'm going to ask at the end is whether or not people feel like the alliance I proposed would do more good than harm if we tried to pursue it. And do you agree that it's worthwhile pursuing? And if not, explain your reason why not. At the end, we'll take a poll for that. That said, and see if we can come to some level of consensus that at least this is something worth pursuing, even if it may not be the silver bullet. I think it might be the silver bullet, but is it at least worth pursuing to see whether or not it is? Or do you think that there's some reason it would cause more harm than good? I especially welcome hands from anyone who thinks that it would cause more harm than good. I can't imagine any way that it would cause more harm than do good. That said, I want to let Susie go next.
Yeah, thank you, Garrett. But my question is, right, war is like more harm than good. I mean, war, who does it bring profit? Who is it profiting? You know, when we're at war. And I am absolutely thrilled with the plan that you have. But I wanted to know the difference between the alliance and NATO. You know, is there a difference, or is it like go hand in hand? Yeah, you know, and is it?
The alliance and NATO are very different in that NATO has, you know, it has a very complex process for getting someone allowed into NATO. There are requirements about being in NATO that you have to keep a certain amount of spending. You have to contribute a certain amount of money to NATO as a whole, to the NATO organization as a whole. None of that is a requirement of this alliance. There's literally no costs. There's no, you know, restrictions to entrance. Anyone is allowed to enter. You know, as long as you haven't been rejected within a reasonable period of time, you are allowed to enter. So those are the main ways that it differs from NATO. There's no red tape in this alliance that I'm proposing. No red tape at all. It's really the red tape, you know, if there's any, it lies in the United Nations, which is already very familiar with red tape and how to work with it. And in that case, I would argue there's a good level of red tape that isolates it from the sort of political influence that Gene is concerned about and that other people are concerned about, where, you know, it might be influenced by the powers that be. But again, I think the UN has already shown that they will not be influenced by the powers that be, even when they get strong-armed into trying to be influenced. Does that make sense, Susie?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And is that part? Is this alliance like part of the United Nations?
This doesn't exist. I'm just proposing it. The alliance doesn't exist. I'm proposing the alliance.
Like if it is happening, right? If you are making it happen, would that be part of like a component of United Nations where they would be overseen by the global community?
Probably the United Nations would be the right ones to house the alliance and like who is a member of the alliance and who is not, since they're the arbiters of who gets to stay and who gets kicked out. So yeah, it would probably make sense for it to be administered by the UN, because there is always a certain level of overhead in administering anything, even if it is a low overhead. So probably, yeah, it would be administered by the UN.
Yeah, because it will go by the foundation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? That they ratified in 1948.
Yeah. And so with that, I want to let Gene go next.
Right. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Susie.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to say I'm not a pessimist. I'm a skeptic and a realist. So I don't mind looking forward to a bright future, but I would like to take the most prudent course that would get us there, if that's even possible. So just one thing I want to say. Second of all, since you keep going back to the Iraq War, there were also human rights violations involved in that, not just WMDs. So would that have been justification for the war?
So it could have been, but remember that those human rights violations were not, you know, perceived by Saddam to be enough to leave him vulnerable. He thought, from his perspective, that as long as he didn't have weapons of mass destruction, the US wouldn't dare to go in there. And so if he knew that having human rights violations would leave him vulnerable and make him very likely to die.
You think he was acting completely irrationally in his behavior? Like he actually planned, you know, you think Putin is being completely irrational right now?
If I were a person, like, I think Saddam was actually taking a calculated risk in thinking that the US wouldn't invade him. I don't think he believed he would be invaded because he knew he had gotten rid of the weapons of mass destruction. And I don't think he anticipated that the US would go after him as hard as he did. And quite frankly, I was quite surprised that the US went after him as hard as he did. So I'm not surprised that Saddam was surprised too. I don't like, there are so many countries committing human rights violations right now around the world that committing human rights violations alone doesn't make you a target for being invaded.
Well, now, what would be the level that, you know, who would decide, and how would you even set a level like that? Here's
the fun part, Gene, is if you could not commit human rights violations, or you were no longer part of, like, if committing human rights violations made you no longer allowed to be a part of this alliance, every country's leaders would think twice before allowing human rights violations to exist within their borders.
Well, what about large groups? Like, okay, let's say somebody mentioned like female circumcision, things like that, religious ideologies.
Right.
There will be still a lot of actors that were willing to form local alliances over things like that, that disagreed maybe with another part of the world, and another part of the world would just not care about such issues. So how would you go about handling things like that?
They can form local alliances today. What I'm proposing is an alliance to trump all other alliances, right?
Well, they would say, you know, this is our right. This is not a human right violation. Our religion says this is what we should do. And if you're trying to force your view upon us, you're the ones committing, you know, human rights violations.
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what they say. It matters what the UN says. So the UN would be the arbiter of who's committing human rights violations.
Well, as you know, League of Nations had similar ideals, and that did not go very well historically.
As far as I know, the alliance that I'm proposing here has never been presented anywhere in the history of the world.
I mean, I think it's a good idea and it's worth trying to pursue, but how would you go about that in a practical manner?
Well, you got to put me in touch with some politicians that are well connected.
Well,
might
I'd
reach out
love to
some
if I had
that I
some.
know, but
If I knew some, I'd love to, but
yeah.
I'm just being practical here.
Yeah, you know, I get it. And I consider myself a realistic idealist. I am an idealist and I use that to guide me, but I keep myself grounded in the practical. I do think this is practical. I've laid out the groundwork for it, but not all the details. You'll notice that I said a lot of, reasonable period of time type of stuff to be worked out later. I'm laying the broad brushstrokes because
Okay,
there are
well,
details to be worked
another
out.
issue. Okay, can I say another issue you mentioned? Yes, where I agree with you. Historically, if you look at the individual, we're better off than we ever been throughout human history. But if you look, for example, like economic disparity between the rich and the poor, it's about on the level as it was during the Great Depression in the United States. So what about things like that?
Yeah, that's another topic for another night.
And another thing, we have nuclear weapons, which were never really an issue in all of human history before. A single person could not destroy the world.
I agree. That only creates more of a need for peace. And I think the proposal that I'm making actually makes peace a much more likely outcome for the world than it is today, even though we're at the most peaceful time in human history. We can be more peaceful, and that's what I'm trying to aim for, is to create a more peaceful world.
I mean, that's peace is always good for everybody, but looking back at history, unfortunately, that's not how it usually works out.
Well, we are getting more and more peaceful. That's what Steven Pinker's book Enlightenment Now shows, is that we're at the most peaceful point in human history that's ever existed.
If you look at basic statistics, sure, but I'm just saying that's not necessarily going to be the case. If somebody mentioned 10 years ago that United States would be, split so deeply, on partisan lines, I would have thought you're crazy. Would you have foreseen January 6th, for example, 10 years ago?
No, would never have guessed it. Yeah. But that we had another couple of events on that. But that said, I want to let Nader go because we have a bunch of hands up now. So thank you for your comments. Really appreciate it. And appreciate the cautious pessimism, but still openness to this may be a good idea. I appreciate that. So Nader, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Garrett. You mentioned you can't think of any harm. The one harm I can think of from this idea is it could potentially bring more division, because now you have an alliance, a group of nations working together. I think somebody else actually may have mentioned this before. It's not going to stop a bunch of other countries to make their own alliance, because it's going to be based on this alliance is going to be based on human rights as defined in UN, but other countries say, hey, this is how we see our human rights, or what's the right way to go. So potential harm could come out from that, but also it kind of creates. We already have UN, right? So could this be worked into the UN in our existing framework already, like UN, so that the UN could, I mean, UN is us, right? It is. US is a big part of it. A lot of countries that will be in this new alliance are already in the UN. So why not work the UN to work? By the way, I think it's a great idea, but make the UN work in a similar way. Go with the UN. That way, all the other countries are part of it. And it doesn't create a whole other division, a kind of duplicate effort, but make the UN kind of work.
Yeah, you're right. And that was my response to Susan, is that I think it should be a part of the UN, because, as I mentioned, like, I think the UN should be the sole arbiter of who's allowed in the club and who's not allowed in the club meaning the alliance. So I agree with you. I think it should be administered by the UN, not the UN Security Council, but the UN, because as we've talked about, there's a lot of flaws with the UN Security Council, but a part of the UN should administer this alliance. And so, yeah, I agree with you. As far as like, could other people create another alliance? I don't think I don't think there are enough countries left that would not join this alliance that had enough firepower to even be a potential threat to this alliance, because human rights unite so much of the world that it's a very small minority of countries that are left over. After that, like, the only big one is China, and if they're the odd man out, okay, no problem, like we'll deal with that. But if China doesn't realize them being the odd man out can make them a target, they would realize that if it was them against the free world, right? And if China decided to invade another historical province of ancient China, and they found the whole rest of the free world fighting against them, China would find itself losing a lot of money and a lot of lives very quickly. So I would argue that, yes, it should be united by the UN, to the point of, what if some Middle Eastern countries got together and formed an alliance where female circumcision was a-okay? I don't think they would find they would have enough firepower to be any significant threat. And even if they did, they would just be defending each other, and no one's probably going to invade them. And even if we did invade them, it's not like they could stop us anyway. We've already shown we can invade a Middle Eastern country, without, even with most of the world against us. So, I don't see the threat of another alliance being a significant threat, if that makes sense. But yeah, UN should administer it.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. David Antonio, I forget how you pronounced it.
Yes, hello, David.
David.
Yeah. So, well, first, yes, we are 31 persons or members now. That somebody mentioned that already. We will have always many discrepancies and different point of view that are most of them respectable. But me, and as an average, I think we are pacifists, and I consider myself sometimes also, depends on the situations, pacifist, and
Sorry,
sometimes
say
I'm
that last
neutral.
sentence again. I couldn't hear that clearly.
I consider myself sometimes pacific, and sometimes I also neutral. But sometimes I try to play these roles of this is kind of like a gaming, like a game, trying to be against, because I try to put my shoes in every different character. So I want to be a little bit more in the Russian side this time. It's just because I like this. It's because of my personality. I try to defend the undefendable. So sometimes when I see the news that the population is increasing and we have 8 billions now, and all these conflicts around the world, and sometimes it makes me feel like, not every time, but sometimes make me feel like, well, this is also in a good way. As I said, I'm playing a role, and yes, so in a good way, we are kind of like exploding all the resources. So all the negative things that when we are trying to, as you explained it in your presentation, that we are running out of gas or running out of water, and some sort of territorial things, and some sort of like, it's like a punishment that maybe sometimes we deserve in order to understand the gravity of our problems. And so this is a point that I want to bring. And the other thing that you mentioned about the thing that activated the war, you mentioned also something in the presentation which I agree as well, and for the Tibet. And I also want to refer as well as maybe the first Third World War, which was also the blame of, at the beginning, was some sort of like a princess, some sort of like a king. Somebody killed a king or ex-president from a little country in Europe, and suddenly the war starts. So I want to also put a little bit of maybe I'm not much investigated, but it also could be on the hands of the president of Zelensky as well at the beginning. I don't know too much the story, but as I said, I want to be a little bit more on the other side as well. So that's my little version.
So I don't know if I followed you or not, but I'm going to try to summarize really quickly. Are you saying the world is highly populated, so maybe wars are okay because they help us prevent overpopulation? Is that your point?
That's one of the things, that the role in place that I said that I want to bring there.
Sorry, say that again.
That's one of the role in place that I want to bring. Yes.
Got it. So just to put it out there, there was a very fear mongering, if I can use that word with a famous guy, fear mongering book written in 1968 about how the world was going to overpopulate and there was going to be mass starvation. The world population at the time was 3.5 billion people, which is less than half what it is now. We haven't seen that kind of mass starvation exist because what ends up happening is technology keeps advancing and we get more, like, actually what we've seen is the opposite, is fewer and fewer people are actually living agrarian farmer lives because there's so much automation in farming that now it requires a very small number of people to create a huge amount of farming equipment. And now we have lots of hydroponics and airponics and all kinds of ways of producing even more densely packed food than has ever existed in humanity's history. And so, on the contrary, I would argue that overpopulation is not our biggest worry. We need to worry more, in my opinion, about the fact that we have more and more powerful weapons, and we are not getting better about limiting the scope of those more and more powerful weapons into only the hands of people responsible enough to wield them. And that I have an essay written on. We did an event on it last year, I think, on why, actually, I don't remember if we did an event on this. I don't know if anyone that came to the year in review remembers if we covered it, but I'll try to look. If we didn't, we should do an event on why I think the social sciences are more needed now than the hard sciences. And it's because of this very thing, is that we're getting more power in the hands of more people without a commensurate capability to make sure we know that people are responsible enough to wield the amount of power that they're getting. In fact, I'd argue we have more incompetent people getting more positions of power than I've ever seen in my lifetime in this day and age. So I would argue we're kind of regressing in terms of wisdom and sort of making sure that people are responsible enough to wield the power that they have. That said, that's a different topic for another night. But yeah, Howard, why don't you go next?
Okay, somebody mentioned that people didn't perceive the war would be destroy us all. I'm getting confused. Margaret Millen's book is interesting. She mentioned that sometime about 1890, Helmut von Moltke, the guy that won the Franco-Prussian War of 1871, got up in front of the German parliament, whatever they called it, and he warned them that the day of European cabinet wars was over. These would be national wars, and they'd be damn near impossible to get out of, and they'd be a total disaster. I'm just looking, there was that, his name was Bloch or something like that. He was a businessman or something like that, a Jewish businessman, I think, again in the 1890s. And he predicted the size of the armies was unmanageable. And I'm looking at Wikipedia under Horace Smith Dorian, and apparently he was giving a speech to a bunch of British officers in 1913. He told them that a big war would kill millions of people and wreck civilization as we know it. So, and there is, I think it was a Fleischman Brothers cartoon from about 1930 about people destroying the world, about people killing everybody else off. I think there was something, the little mice are sitting there having Christmas and they're singing peace on earth, goodwill to men, because clearly the men need it because they weren't getting it from other men. It's quite famous. Maybe some of you have seen it.
I'm not familiar with that one. And interesting historical facts, but help tie it to the conversation for me.
We're discussing. I mean, we try to avoid war when we feel threatened. Historically, wars are caused by very small numbers of people. I've got apparently when Mussolini decided to join World War II, King Victor Emmanuel and his generals told me Italy wasn't ready for it, and it got rammed through anyway, and ended disastrously. I'm questioning whether you can build you build an alliance and you say the alliance will enforce peace, but the alliance is being supervised by the UN, and if it works against the interests of one of the main powers, we're back where we started.
But see, that's the point, is the UN has already shown that it's willing to go against its primary power, which is the US, right? They spoke vehemently against the US in the Iraq war. The US tried to twist their arm into saying that we're weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and they refused to do it. So I would say
the UN refused to participate in the war. They didn't deploy troops and actively stop the United States.
Well, again, that's because this alliance didn't exist. If the alliance existed, then maybe we would have seen a different outcome. That's what I'm proposing, is that if the alliance had existed, that I'm proposing had existed before the Iraq war, the US never would have gone into Iraq, because they would have seen Canada, France, Germany defending Iraq against the US. And the US would have been ejected from that alliance for who knows how long. You know, the US would never have done that.
And how would Canada transport? I'm Canadian. How would Canada transport troops to the Middle East?
No, come on. We can
Successfully.
go all over the world now, my friend. Like, this is a global world. Like, we can all take flights anywhere in the world we want to go, anytime we want to go there. We can take boats anywhere in the world we want to go, anywhere we want to go there. It's very easy to transfer.
In peacetime, yes, you can. Not in a war, you can't.
I mean, you know, if you have the whole free world against the US, I hate to tell you, but the US doesn't stand a chance. So Anna, sorry.
I have a very simplistic view of this. Sorry, my dog has something to say. When you first introduced this, it was like everyone in the United States, for example, we're going to be members of the UN, so we're going to want to be part of this consortium, or whatever you want to call it. I'm not sure that everyone in this country would even agree to that.
You can't
And
get everyone in this country
that
to
everyone wants to.
Anna, you can't get everyone in this country to agree that Earth is an oblate spheroid. There are
This is
300,000
true.
Americans that think that Earth is flat. That does not mean that the US would not join the alliance. All you need to do is get the US government to agree to join the alliance. And I do think that there would be enough pressure on the US government to join the alliance, because if they didn't, they would be seen as standing against ending unjust wars for humanity. And that would be a big stain on America's shoulders, like, you know, worse than the Iraq war stain on America's shoulders after the Iraq war, where we lost a huge amount of political capital. So, you know, you don't need every American to agree to this. You don't need every citizen of every country to agree to it. You just need the leadership to agree to it. And I would argue the leadership of almost all of NATO, if not all of NATO, would join.
I disagree. For example, in this country, I think that we are a basically immoral country. So, I mean, look at the distribution of wealth. Look at the distribution of power. I don't think we're a moral country. And over half of the women in this country would agree with me. So
I'm not making the argument that we're a moral country. I agree with you. The US has done a lot of horrible things internationally, but the US has done a very good job at hiding those things. If there was a PR campaign to keep, you know, visibility to who joined the alliance and who didn't, and publicly shame the US for not joining the alliance for a long enough amount of time, or you get other countries that are part of the alliance threatening to switch their reserve countries, this is where you really hold them, you know, accountable, is you get, you know, Germany and, you know, get Euro country, get the Eurozone threatening to move off of the US dollar as a reserve currency, you know, get the rest of the alliance to move off of the US dollar as a reserve currency. Trust me, the US will be on board very, very quickly if they're the only ones holding out.
I think it depends on your values. And I don't see the value of this as promoting morality. Now, if that is your basis for judging this, I don't see it. Okay, you may prevent some wars in the short term, but in the long term, I don't see it.
So where's an example of a war that you think would happen if you had the free world as a member of this alliance? What's an example of a just war that could occur?
The poor people in this country raising up against the rich people.
I mean, that's a revolution. That's not a war, right? That's a revolution. And that is a significant risk. If we continue down the level of socioeconomic disparity that we're going down right now without a change in trajectory, I think your concern there is very valid, and we will end up with a revolution on our hands. We already almost had one. We actually did have one on January. So we're already seeing it. I think there was a lot of misunderstanding that led to that day. It wasn't just socioeconomic disparity, but we already are seeing it. But that is a totally separate conversation, whether or not the US will have a revolution because of socioeconomic disparity. That's still a risk. I'm not solving for that in this solution. Tonight, I'm trying to solve for just international wars, not preventing all revolutions.
Let's go simpler, just Mexico versus the United States and our border.
So who do you think would invade whom?
I don't know. Because
okay,
think about it
and raise your hand again. Let's let Jean go. Think about it and raise your hand again. Try to think about a tangible example of an unjust war that could happen with the alliance that I proposed being in place. So Jean.
I have another what about countries like North Korea and like Russia is acting at this point in time? Countries are willing either to get their way or what's the whole world doing? How would you go by handling something like that?
Yeah, so countries like North Korea and Russia probably would not be in the alliance, right? Russia might be.
Well, they would definitely not be in the alliance, but they are still very capable of nuclear powers that maybe would not win a conventional war, but a nuclear war would not benefit them either, but they would be willing to engage in it.
North Korea would never enter a nuclear war if they knew that all of their leadership would be destroyed. Right, their only reason for having nuclear weapons is to give them political leverage. Like they're not gonna nuke someone because they know as soon as they nuke someone, their whole leadership is dead. Like their entire leadership.
Well, if they're gonna think that's gonna happen anyway, they might, we're gonna go out with a bang. If we're
that's
gonna
why they have leverage. That's why they have leverage, right? And so we are treating them very differently. Trump went there and shook Kim Jong-un's hand, because they have enough leverage, although there may have been other reasons for him shaking his hand that I won't go into, but you have
Jared, it's Kim Jong-un. It's Kim Jong-un. I'm from South Korea, so I know his name.
I think a more practical approach would be an economic coalition, because that's the only thing I see good thing coming out of the Ukraine war, because we could make economically war so unbearable to a country that it would just the people of the country would rise up against the government if it was acting unjustly. And second part would be maybe a defensive coalition. We wouldn't go into a country that was committing human rights violations, but we would prevent international war among countries that already have settled borders.
That is what I proposed, Gene. Yeah, what I proposed was a defensive pact, not an aggressive pact. I didn't say that we would go into the ones that commit human rights violations.
Something like Article 5.
I said we defend any of the ones that don't have human rights violations, which basically leaves the ones with human rights violations as exposed and undefended, which means that anyone who has human rights violations will quickly get rid of them so that they can then join the alliance and be defended.
Well, I think economic pressure would work a lot better than that and be less of a threat for a global, thermonuclear war than a military alliance. Because maybe it wouldn't work on countries like North Korea, because obviously they seem to be, they're not doing fine, but they're getting along somehow. But for countries like Russia, if things really got bad economically, I think there would be change.
Yeah, I mean, North Korean's population is like starving and like impoverished, so I don't think they're doing just fine. And
They're not living a good life, but they're living.
I
Their
mean, some of
military
them
is pretty
are,
well
and some
funded
of
for
them are dying in camps, right? So, they're
since I am from Korea, may I say something regarding Korea?
sure.
They found somebody a couple of years ago who had defected to South Korea, and then but something happened to him, and he was hospitalized or something. And when they looked inside his body was just so messed up, so full of worms, and I mean, it was like body of somebody from 17th, 18th century living lifestyle. Gene, most North Koreans are living in a very
I
dire
understand
state.
that, but they still have military power. They have nuclear weapons. It doesn't take a huge, well-trained and well-maintained military when you have nuclear weapons. They could, if they wanted to, you don't think they could destroy South Korea if they wanted to? Yes, it would cost them a lot, probably everything, but it doesn't mean that would stop him from, if Kim Jong-il knew that tomorrow he's getting deposed and there's nothing he could do about it, you don't think he would use nuclear weapons?
I have tendency to agree with Garrett that they're using nuclear weapon as a leverage.
Yeah,
I think it's, of course they are.
I think it's as leverage.
Worst comes to worst. Yeah,
I agree with you. I agree with you, Gene, that he would use them, but I do think that he's mostly using them for leverage. And even with what you're saying, it's still acknowledging that he's using them as leverage. He's using them as leverage.
North Korea doesn't have long-range missiles, so let's leave them out. What about some place like China, which do and have a lot of them?
Well, China, I mean, China's a different story. Like, China, if they knew that they had human rights, if they had human rights violations and they invaded Taiwan, that the entire free world would defend Taiwan, I don't think China would go into Taiwan. So I think this would be an active deterrent against China.
Hopefully the Ukrainian war was an example, why they shouldn't do it. But if Xi thought that he was going to be deposed or or the military top of the leadership would think that, it's hard to predict what people in desperate situations might do, especially with all that power.
But that's the point. This is not an invading. This is not an invading alliance, Gene. Right? It is exactly what you're saying, in that it's an economic alliance. In that, by being a defensive alliance, it makes it economically unsustainable to invade any country. You will simply never win by invading another country.
Sure, but just consider what will happen to the rest of what will happen to the rest of the world if we just broke off connection with China. We are so dependent on an international marketplace right now. They're dependent on us and we're dependent on them. Yes, it would be terrible for both sides if that were to happen, but some people are more willing to take that risk than others.
So we're not trying to solve all problems internationally tonight. We're just trying to end unjust wars.
Yeah, let's start with world peace and move on from there, right?
Yeah, all I'm proposing that I've laid out is a way to end unjust wars. And with that said, it's 8:47, so I want to take a couple of votes here. And let me go back to my slides. Is one, I would love people to add in the comments. Do you think that that, let's put it this way, when you came tonight, did you think that world peace would be possible? And so say before : and then yes or no for whether or not you thought world peace would be possible. And then do you think it's possible after the presentation, and then say like after yes or no. And so I'm going to say, I had the unfair advantage of seeing the presentation before tonight, but I'm going to say before, actually, I would say before I came up with the idea, I'm going to say no. And then after, I'm going to say yes. So this is my example of before no, after yes. So I see
now and
people
again,
saying
please.
that they have other methods for ending war and creating peace on earth. I would love to hear what those are. Trevor and Mohanad, if you guys want to raise your hands, I'd love to hear your proposals. Trevor, go ahead.
I think we should determine what the source of power is and go after that. What's the source of power? People.
Sometimes power just wants more power.
Yeah, but where
Sometimes
does
it's
it?
economics. Sometimes it's just egoistic, motivations.
What are you proposing there, Trevor? Like eliminate all humanity? That would end wars, but
Well, yeah, that would probably
take
work
away.
too.
Take away. The only way politicians get away with this is because of public support. Ultimately.
Well, how do you change 8 billion opinions?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. How do you change 8 billion opinions?
I thought the information age would be so great for humanity, it would solve so many problems. And maybe I'm kind of pessimistic about this, but it seems the more information is available, the less people use it.
What if you don't even have to change opinions though?
Well,
what if you just teach people how to distinguish between an opinion and a fact?
Well, critical thinking is not that easy to teach to a lot of people in my, in my experience. I mean,
but that's your experience. What if you learn how to desire to know what is true?
Well, that would be great, but how do you propose we would do that?
Well, I don't know. Like, doesn't it seem like a good idea to desire?
Well, yeah, it definitely seems like a good idea. I just don't know how to go about accomplishing it.
Right. Okay. So there we go. We've had one success.
So if we have more people thinking critically and logically, that would be great for everybody. But just seeing how polarized America is getting, I don't know if that's possible. That might just be going against human nature.
Is that actually a requirement, though? Do you actually require people to be able to think critically?
Well, even tolerance seems to be going down, in my opinion. I may be wrong about this. I haven't done actual statistics on this, but just from my casual observations, it seems to be going down. And people are becoming.
Crimes are going up. So I think there's statistics to back your assertion there, Gene. Guys, I do want to. Yeah, we are going off topic here a little bit. So there was one other person, Mohanad, that had a solution. You want to share your solution, Mohanad? Oh, Janice has her hand up, and I don't think it's spoken. So go ahead, Janice.
Hi, thank you. I did come in a little bit late. I apologize. I did miss the original presentation, but this is things that have been going in my life for many decades. I don't know if this was proposed, but I did have some ideas. First of all, I do believe that removing religion could actually be the answer to what we're trying to achieve, in the sense that we work together as a whole to take care of the world as a whole. And that I lost my train of thought now. I do believe that there's no need for borders and countries. I think that we don't need to keep segregating ourselves, distinguishing ourselves from other cultures and ethnicities. If we work together as a whole, if we put it in the fact that we are human beings, for lack of a broader term for us, Homo sapiens, whatever word you want to use, we are essentially all the same. And the great vast majority of us do all want this peace in this world. We don't know how to do it, where to go, et cetera, and giving one power, one person, it's almost like it could. I don't want to get confused with what some people talk about, the new world order, where one person takes care of everything. Like, honestly, if everybody did the right thing by everybody else, there would be no need. There would be no wars. But the fact is, how do we get people there? For me, it's basically being open, honest, and truthful with your own self, not just externally, but with your own self. So these are things that I've been toying with for decades. My model that I came up with basically is this world belongs to no one, and yet it belongs to everyone. If we can get to wrap our heads around that society as a whole is what's destroying or can ultimately bring peace. It's a choice. How do we get there? This is a good place to start. Like I said, I missed the presentation. I don't know what was discussed. I'd like to get that information, but I'm willing to talk this kind of conversations with Garrett and whoever else. But yes, this is decades worth of thought that I've had in my head and never an outlet to actually talk about this. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm happy to continue the conversation in the online community, but we're going to wind down in the next 5 minutes. And because we do have a hard stop at 9 o'clock. Ginny, you have your hand up next, and then we'll go to Trevor.
Yeah, I'm in agreement generally with Janice, and I like to say, think globally, act globally.
Yeah.
Think of ourselves as earthling as opposed to, this country, this state, that state. We need to think globally.
I agree
that's all I
completely.
want to say.
I don't know if I would go so far as to say there's no need to have countries and borders. I think there's a lot of nice things about having different countries with their own rules and their own cultures. Having been someone that lived in another country for a year one time and a month another time, I really appreciate the diversity that the world has to offer with different countries. But I also would like to see it a more fair place. And so that's what I'm trying to do with the proposal here, is to make it a more fair place. But still a very diverse place where there's a wide variety of opinions and beliefs and values. I think there's a lot of room for that. But that said, I want to let Trevor go because he felt cut off. So I didn't mean to cut you off, Trevor, but you started going off with someone and we were Gene on a tangent. So I cut in, but go ahead.
Well, what I'm proposing is really quite modest. It's essentially we follow the lead of science, which has demonstrated itself to be highly competent in revealing truth. Granted, they're working in a much simpler environment, but how science works is scientists genuinely care what is true. And this culture of asserting ideas that pop into your head as true in fact, does not fly in science. But if you even suggest this idea that everyone loves it when it comes to science, but if you suggest that someone adopts the same approach for metaphysical matters, everyone's mind changes. They refuse to deal with truth. People insist on making a guess and insisting that their guess is correct. Why? Why do people do this?
So,
and
go ahead.
Might there be a way to get them to stop doing it?
So Trevor, I actually would encourage you to read an essay that I wrote on science and religion and how they can get along. I did a presentation on this last year. And basically I use a 400 level computer science theorem called Gödel's incompleteness theorem to show that science, which is very good at revealing consistent truths, does not prove true all truths in reality. And there are actually truths that science itself can never prove true, even if we had perfect knowledge of all scientific laws. And so actually there is room for inconsistent knowledge bases, I refer to them as, which is spirituality, religion, and some types of philosophy, which are inconsistent, to complement science. I am a scientist myself and a hyper rationalist by test taking. When I took my saboteur's test, I'm a hyper rationalist and I follow logic wherever it lies. And Trevor, to be fair, I've got a lot of metaphysical insights that have come out of logical inquiry, which we could talk about in the online community if you're interested in that. And so I think that that science and rational thought can be used to create a lot of metaphysical insights, but there's also a space for wisdom to come from inconsistent knowledge, to be complementary to that which science brings to the fore. So science.
But that's my point is that, like you're saying that not everything can be resolved to a truth. That's the point. What humans can get to objectively is unknown. 9 times out of 10, that's as far as we can get is unknown, except most people can't get to unknown. What they can only get to is what is a guess. Any idea is either true or false. Unknown is not available. It's not. Watch how people talk.
Yeah, if what you're saying, Trevor, is that people are too quick to jump to conclusions rather than to acknowledge they may not have the answer, I agree with you completely. And you made some comments in the chat about how people are very much mired in confirmation bias, and I agree with that completely. That's why we have an event on it later this year, is how to get yourself unstuck from confirmation bias. And so that said, I'm going to let Ginny go, and then I'm going to kind of take one final poll and then close out. Go ahead, Ginny.
Well, I sent you a private message, but I'll announce it to the group. What a wonderful topic tonight. Thank you so much, Garrett.
Thank you.
Such an important and wonderful topic.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Ginny, and I appreciate everybody's contributions. I do want to ask one more poll is, does anyone think that there's harm in pursuing the solution that I put forth, whether or not you think that we can end unjust wars from it? You know, does it sound like it would be worth pursuing to see whether or not it might end unjust wars? And I'd love a vote for, like, you know, yes, pursue, and no, don't pursue. And if you say no, say why not? Like, what would be your hesitation in pursuing it? And I'll just give people, you know, 15 or 20 seconds. Janice, reach out in the online community, and I would love to chat with you about how to move this forward. I do have some political connections, not really strong ones, but I have some possible avenues that I can explore there.
Yes, it is worth of pursuing. I would say just like UN. Well, I don't think it do any harm to the world. It's always it's good, at least, right? People can express something, have a consensus. We may not accomplish anything, but at least, you know, the world can talk, you know, what is right, what is wrong. Eventually, still superpower decide, you know, what do you do? Just like UN, right? UN does have teeth. UN basically controlled by superpowers, right? Basically US.
Great. So I'm getting a lot of yeses and a few people saying no, but mostly yeses, which is very encouraging. I think it's worth pursuing. I still plan to pursue it in the very little bit of spare time that I have, and would welcome people collaborating on that. I just want to kind of close things out and thank you all for a great conversation, outstanding questions, outstanding commentary. Mohamed, if you're open to sharing your solution in the online community, I would still love to hear it. I know you didn't raise your hand, but I would still love to hear your solution as well. Maybe there's some way of collaborating and incorporating both of our ideas together and making a better solution, which I'm very open to. Thank you all for coming tonight. Oh, the online community. Let me share the link. Someone just asked, what is the online community? So I'm gonna post normally Ellis posts these, but she was on a tablet tonight, so she may have had trouble posting it. The online community is the first link that I just posted. It's called Discord, is the software we use. And it's an online community where we chat between these events on Tuesday evenings. And we just kind of get to know each other better and talk about intellectually interesting things. So if you're one of those people that craves deep conversations like the one we had tonight, you'll probably love the online community, and it's a great way to meet other people that are other intellectually minded people to talk about meaningful subjects. So I would love for people to join there, and let's continue the conversation. And topic suggestions are always welcome. Thank you all for joining. No problem, Mohanad. So we'd love to chat in the online community. So thank you all again. Hope you all have a great rest of your night. So many good comments. I have so much fun at these, and it's all because of you guys. And I hope you guys had a good time as well. So, and if not, give me feedback. Give feedback either way, whether you did or didn't have a good time, because we want to keep improving these sessions. So feedback is always welcome on how we can do better. So
Thank you. Thank you again, Garrett. Thank you.
Thanks a
Bye-bye.
lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Garrett.
Bye-bye.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Thank you.